leaving that meeting, heading back to London, and some important parliamentary business today. Let's reflect on that. Today's Brexit developments and what might happen next. Joining us from Westminster, Lucy Thomas, Senior Director at Edelman PR, and Jonathan Isaby, Editor of Brexit Central. Welcome both. Jonathan, I'm going to start with you. This is, I suppose, the defining question for many people today. How serious is this administration about negotiating a deal with Brussels?
Well, Boris Johnson has said over and over that he wants to do it. And the question is, will the European Union be willing to move from the withdrawal agreement that they agreed with Theresa May and that was rejected 3 times by the House of Commons to propose something that would be acceptable to the House of Commons? So the ball is very much in the European Union's court on this.
Lucy, The Times today carries a report about civil servants who may have been involved in Brexit negotiations being redeployed, office space that they took up being reassigned. What's your sense about the seriousness of intent of this government to secure a deal?
Well, I mean, you heard Amber Rudd when she was explaining her resignation over the weekend, suggesting that 90% of the government's efforts is currently on no-deal planning versus around 10% on working out those alternative arrangements. And I think that really is at the crux of this as to whether a new deal can be found, because the EU has said, you know, we're willing to talk, but it's down to the UK to come up with what it thinks those alternative arrangements should look like. It's not for the EU to budge and to suggest new things. As they keep saying, there is one withdrawal agreement on the table which we negotiated over many, many months, and if the UK now wants to change that, it is down to the UK to suggest how that might be done.
Jonathan, as Lucy tells it, it's clear this government sought to prioritise no-deal planning, and I suppose you and many others would say, well, of course they would, because they'd spent 3 years not doing that. Quite the opposite, in fact.
Oh, absolutely. I think certainly the government machine is making up for lost time on that front. And by the way, if the government weren't doing that no-deal planning, people would jump up and down and say it's a disgrace the government isn't preparing for that eventuality. So it's absolutely right that they should be preparing for that no-deal scenario, which may yet come to pass because, as Leo Varadkar made clear in Dublin just now, it is not a given that the European Union will agree to a further extension. The European Union would want to have a very good reason to give for an extension to Article 50 yet again. We heard noises from the French Foreign Minister over the weekend that, as it stands at the moment, he doesn't think that an extension should be given. And I think the anti-Brexit mob, the enthusiastic Remainers, need to think on that. It is a serious prospect that the European Union may say, look, we've had enough of this. We want to get on with our own plans, our own future. We want to do more centralisation, more integration, all the rest of it. The UK is in the way, frankly. Let's call it quits and say no more extensions. And, I think increasingly, the British public feel the same way. Let's just get out, come what may, deal or no deal, on October the 31st, as Boris Johnson has said he wants to do too.
Just hearing from the Prime Minister... Sorry, Lucy, just a thought about something else we're hearing about. The Prime Minister's spokesperson talking about Parliament being prorogued tonight until October the 14th. Lucy, you're going to come in. You might need to reframe your answer, actually, slightly in light of what we've just heard, that proroguing suspension of Parliament will happen from tonight. So we won't get a few more days parliamentary business. And there'll be people who say, well, OK, that's the government realising that actually that a few more days of parliamentary business would only lead, for instance, to the Rebel Alliance demanding full disclosure on things like Operation Yellowhammer, etc. They've decided to draw a line under things.
Yeah, and I think this is, changing the rules as the game is playing because things aren't going in the way that the government likes. And it is the ultimate irony that the Brexit referendum was, for many on the Leave side, an opportunity to take back control for Parliament, and they are absolutely ignoring the will of Parliament, even suggesting that they might go as far as breaking the law and not taking into account the bill that has been passed. So I think that is, it perhaps won't shock that many because that is the strategy of this government, to do what it wants in order to get its desired outcome.
Yeah. But, Jonathan, it's also in the government's constitutional gift to prorogue when it wants, right?
It certainly is. I've got to come back at several points Lucy made there. Firstly, she said that the government was changing the rules mid-game. Well, frankly, this is what the Remainer crew in Parliament have been doing throughout this process. I was going to say they've used every trick in the book. Frankly, they've used tricks that weren't even in the book. They've changed the rules, they've changed the way Parliament works in a way to frustrate the will of the people, and that's what this comes back to. Lucy says, oh, the government's trying to frustrate the will of Parliament. What about the will of the people? The people voted 3 years ago, more than 3 years ago, in unprecedented numbers to leave the European Union. It was the biggest mandate that there's ever been for anyone or anything in British electoral history. And it is the British people who are sovereign, not Parliament, and it is the will of the people that should now be being enacted.
Yeah,
also hearing... Sorry, Lucy, go on.
I couldn't agree more, actually. And as Jonathan knows, I've consistently said since the referendum that Brexit should happen and that, you know, the best way forward should be found. But crucially, the question is, did people vote to leave with no deal when they voted back in 2016? And I would argue that they didn't, because the Leave campaign was clear that we would leave with a deal, that there would be minimal, if any, disruption, that the economy and jobs wouldn't be affected and so on. And so for the argument now to have become that leaving means leaving with no deal and any other kind of Brexit isn't pure or proper, that's what I have real issue with, because I think if you did ask the people whether they, in the majority, wanted to leave with no deal, I'm not sure they would agree. And so my argument would be that you would need really a mandate from the people to go out on no deal, because that isn't what was delivered in June 2016.
Prime Minister's spokesperson also saying they will not, Downing Street will not seek an extension beyond October the 31st, a restatement of that die-in-a-ditch strategy. Jonathan, let's just turn our thoughts to something else slightly. The French Foreign Minister has said that the French may consider blocking, seriously may consider blocking a request for an extension. The exact quote was, we're not going to keep going through this every 3 months.
And I entirely sympathise with his position. You know, he and the other EU national leaders and governments who are enthusiastic members of the European Union have plans. They want to do more integration, more centralisation, more pooling of sovereignty in all kinds of areas, which clearly the British people don't want to do, because it's why they wanted to leave the European Union in the first place. And until this whole question is resolved once and for all, the UK still will be sat around those tables and they won't be able to proceed with those plans. You know, at the end of the day, the British people wanted something different than the rest of the European Union about the relationship with Europe. And, you know, we need to accept that we want different things, therefore we part amicably. And frankly, the longer we are there, the more tired the rest of the European Union is going to get of us being there, and indeed of the British people too.
Lucy, just a brief thought, if we can, on polls. What do you say to those people who point to the polls and say, look, we are beginning to see evidence from surveys showing that people are desperate to see an end to this, and they incline increasingly to this rather chiaroscuric idea of Boris Johnson, people's champion, Parliament, stuff with the elite, unrepresentative?
Well, I think you can read a lot into polls and you can ask all sorts of different questions, but I don't think you can then change the whole course of government or whole strategy based on that. Really asking the question and getting people's answers at the ballot box in some form is a better way. You could surmise that if you add together certain parties, you could say, you know, that the number of people who support Labour, SNP, some other parties mean that you should do X kind of policy. But unless you actually ask them, unless you allow people to have their say at the ballot box, I think it's really dangerous to make those decisions based on that.
OK. Lucy Thomas, Jonathan Isaby, thanks both very much indeed. Thanks a lot.
Lung cancer affects around